Alright guys, welcome back. If you're new here, this is RPScapedTanks. You probably knew that already considering when you clicked on the video, it said the name of the channel and what this was about. So you clicked on this to see how to make your own do-it-yourself CO2. The reason I'm making this video is because I haven't seen a lot of channels or just do-it-yourself aquarium channels make CO2 with the citric acid and baking soda method. I've seen the yeast and sugar method, which I have no problem with. It's just a little messy and you can't stop it. At least with this and the system that I'm using, you'll be able to stop it. So we finally got the tools that I need, or the equipment that I need, to set up CO2 into this tank. Now, it is a do-it-yourself system with a do-it-yourself solenoid. At the time of recording, I've never used a solenoid because it's on the bubble counter. So we will see how it goes, but let's set this up right now. So to begin to make your do-it-yourself CO2, you're gonna need a couple of things. You're going to need some citric acid, baking soda, a measuring cup, a scale, 2 carbonated soda bottles, your actual do-it-yourself CO2 system, some airline tubing with a diffuser, your bubble counter with attached solenoid or solenoid for it, and that's it. So let's get started. One more thing you will need that I forgot is a funnel. You will definitely need this. It will make your life so much easier. So first, what you're going to want to do is measure out 200 grams of your citric acid. Now what I like to do in instances like this is make sure that you have your cup measured out and you zero out your scale first. That's one mistake you could always forget, and you end up adding too much and you dilute it. So we're going to measure out 200 grams of your citric acid. I believe it's about a cup, but you know, just measure it out anyway with the scale. Keeps it a little more accurate. If you're off by a gram or two, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. Just like I just went over. So as you can see, that's not 200 grams on the dot, but it is very close. So we're going to live with that. So now for this next part, you're going to want to take one of your 2-liter soda bottles. Doesn't really matter. It could be Sprite, it could be Coke. As long as it's a carbonated 2-liter soda bottle. That's the most essential thing. I'm just going to place it right down on there. Take your handy dandy funnel, place it in there, and you're going to pour your citric acid into that bottle. All of it. To add on to this, what you're gonna have to do, see, that's what 200 grams looks like, or just about 200 grams. So what we're gonna actually see is now we have to add water to this to dilute this, because obviously it's not just gonna bubble up and get into that. For the citric acid bottle, you're gonna want 600 milliliters of water. That's about 2.5 cups. Like I said, this doesn't have to be an exact science, but you want to get it as close as possible, because it will ensure that you have efficient CO2 delivery. If we can see that, little science for you guys. Whenever you see and you're measuring liquids, always measure the bottom of the meniscus. We're going to pour our water into there. And what I like to do is rinse around the funnel. I know it's really hard to see because the funnel's black. Rinse around the funnel just to get the rest of the citric acid residue, if any's stuck on there, in there. Okay, so that's 500 milliliters. I added in another 100 milliliters because I only put 500 in before. So, okay, so that's what your mixture should look like. That's just about where it should come up to with the citric acid in there as well. Take your funnel off. I usually just like keeping it right there for now. And you're gonna want to mix this a little bit. Now, it doesn't have to be cold or warm water. It's really a personal preference. I just like using room temperature water, because if you use hot water, the bottle might expand. If you use cold water, the bottle might shrink a little bit. You know, neutral water is the way to go for this. Now you can see all the powder is pretty much dissolved at this point. It's very quick. It doesn't take too long. Now, when you stop mixing this up, some will settle towards the bottom. That's perfectly fine too. You might need to stir this occasionally, but it is do-it-yourself CO2, so it's essentially pays for itself. This I will link in the description. These you can get at your grocery store. I will link this in the description as well, and the baking soda. So now, after drying the cup, because it was a little bit wet, you just rinse this out, and you want to make sure this is as dry as possible, because when you put the baking soda in there, it will clump. And there we go, 0. Now we're going to want to measure 200 grams of the baking soda in this cup. So we're at 201 grams. That's perfectly fine. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exact, just very close to, as close to 200 as possible. So we're gonna do the exact same thing we did with the citric acid. We're gonna pour that into there. Now, a really good simple trick you can use for your baking soda or baking powder, if yours happens to be a little clumpy, as this one is a little bit. Now, it's just been sitting there for a while. It's been a while since I made this do-it-yourself CO2, so it does tend to clump up a little bit. To kind of get that into the funnel, it's going to start clogging up this funnel, and it's going to be very annoying. So what I like to do is take the back of a spoon and just try to break up those clumps, get it to as fine of a powder as possible, and this also helps with it mixing into the water that we're going to add. Okay, now that we are at a fine powder, fine-ish powder, we're gonna pour the 200 grams of baking soda into our second bottle. Now look, even though I made it super fine, it still gets clogged up. That's okay. All you do is just break up the clumps a little bit. A little more difficult with one hand, but there you go. And there we go. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to add 200 milliliters of water into the baking soda bottle. Now for this one, if you remember, we added 600 milliliters, so that's a 3-to-1 ratio of citric acid to water, and we're going to do a 1-to-1 ratio of baking soda to water. And we're just going to pour that in there. Now, like I said, just like the citric acid, try to get around the funnel to get all the remaining particles of your baking soda in there, and that's that. See, very simple. Now you can see it's not a lot, but what we're going to need to do is just mix that up a little bit. Now the baking soda is going to make the water extremely cloudy, as you can see, but it is mixed in there. Some of it will settle, just like the citric acid. There's some particles in there, but for the majority it is mixed. So now let's hook these up to the do-it-yourself system, and we'll see how to do that. Now when you're doing this with your do-it-yourself system, mine specifically says citric acid. It tells you citric acid and baking soda, A and B. Now if you don't have that to remember, just remember that you're measuring pressure out of the citric acid side because it needs to travel into here, and the CO2 is going to come out of here, out of the baking soda side. So if you don't have these labels, just remember that citric acid pressure needs to be red, and that's going to be your citric acid side, whichever side has the pressure gauge in there. Also, if this is your second time doing this, or you've had this system running for a couple of times, there is some corrosion that will happen between the baking soda and some of the metal here. Now, it's nothing toxic to the fish. It's not going to be able to get in there for the fish, but it will get into these little threads right here that, I don't know if you can see that, but these little threads right here that make the connection with the bottle. You want to make sure that that's as clean as possible. There are also little O-rings in there. I do like cleaning them and wiping them every time I have to make this over again, just for the sake of having zero leaks or preventing as many leaks as possible. As well as your O-rings, you want to make sure that you're using silicone grease on the inside of them if they do look dry. Silicone grease is very cheap. You can get it on Amazon. I'll link the one I got off of Amazon, or you can just go to your department store and get it. Now you want to make sure that your O-rings are in the proper place. I will touch back on this when we put the bubble counter on there, but for now, let's get this on there, and I'll show you how to build up some pressure. Okay, so there we have it. No airline tubing hooked up yet. We just have our bottles hooked up. We have baking soda and citric acid on this side, okay? Remember, it was 200 grams of citric acid, 600 milliliters of water, 3-to-1 ratio, 200 grams of baking soda or baking powder, and 200 milliliters of water, a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so now we're good. So what we're gonna do to build pressure is, this is really funny. So these gauges are not 100% accurate. I refuse to believe that they're 100% accurate, but it's what comes with it, and it's really hard and a pain to get this off and replace it, so I just leave it on there. Just make sure that if you try to replace it and you decide that you want to keep this, make sure all of your seals are airtight and CO2 tight, basically. So yes, what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to squeeze this bottle to get the citric acid to flow in through here, through this tube, because there's an air tube in here, down into this baking soda side, and build up pressure in this bottle right here. Right now there's no pressure in there. A lot of people say that it's gonna be very easy. It's a couple of squeezes. It is not a couple of squeezes whatsoever. Mine isn't anyway. Maybe it's different for everyone else's. Maybe there's like a minute leak here and there. You could have those minute leaks. It is a possibility with these because these are very cheap, and this is the best one out of the do-it-yourself CO2 systems that I've seen, that I find very effective. Now, when you're doing this too, you want to make sure that your needle valve, this is your needle valve right here, you want to make sure that your needle valve is as closed as possible, because if you have this open, all you're going to do is create CO2, and that pressure is going to build up and come right out of here. So let's give this a squeeze more than a few times, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, and build some pressure, and I'll show you exactly where your pressure should be. Okay, so we have all that squeezing done, and this is all the pressure that we built up. Now you want to get that pressure gauge into the green. So like I said before, these pressure gauges, I wouldn't trust them, but at least get it into the green, because I've noticed as long as it's there, you can get a decent amount of flow of citric acid back into there, because it'll start creating this negative pressure effect to where once this pressure starts decreasing, it'll want to maintain into that green, and it's going to start pulling up citric acid itself, and it's going to be a continuous cycle until you run out of citric acid. I know you saw me shake this before, so what happens is, if you can see, there is settling, I don't know if you can see that difference, but there is floating particles of baking soda and then the settled baking soda right there. If you mix this and if you shake this up a little bit, you'll create that negative difference again, and that reaction will go forward, and you'll pull citric acid into the other side. Now be careful when you're doing this, when you're already at the proper pressure, because you will end up going over. Now the biggest concern I have with going over is these bottles can handle that. These bottles are made to be able to handle a lot more pressure than is actually in them, which is why I always recommend using carbonated soda bottles. But this, you're always going to run the risk of springing a leak, because you don't know if any of these seals are able to hold that amount of pressure in there. This gauge might say so, but these parts and materials may not. So you always want to be careful of that. I'm going to show you a little trick. Now this is wasting a little bit of CO2, but it does create that negative pressure difference. What you're going to want to do is essentially just let this loose. You hear it. And then you're just going to want to close it back as quickly as possible. What happens is, see that? It starts creating that negative pressure because there's CO2 leaving, but that pressure still stayed the same. So you can do that a couple of times too, but just be mindful, it will waste some of your CO2 that you made in here initially. So I'm going to get this up to pressure, and we'll be back. We'll hook this all up, and then we should be good to go. There's citric acid moving into that bottle, the baking soda bottle, and we are in the green. Just barely, but we are in the green, and that's totally fine too. What you can do is leave this, and eventually it will equilibrize or reach an equilibrium, and there will be a little more pressure built up. Let's get that airline tubing and the hoses hooked up to this. You need an O-ring on this, because this is where your bubble counter is going to go. You definitely need an O-ring on here, because you will leak CO2 and it'll just waste all of your hard work. Oh my god, and I can't believe one more thing that I almost forgot before you set this up, before you put your CO2 on, you need a check valve. Ideally, you want to place this as close to the diffuser as possible, obviously not in the water, but probably as soon as it comes right out of the water, right there, because you don't want water to flow back into this. That would be a giant pain. Okay guys, so now that I've had the CO2 system set up in the shrimp tank for about a month now, let's go over some pros and cons of doing a do-it-yourself CO2 system as opposed to a pressurized system. Now, I've already been using a do-it-yourself system for a very long time. If you haven't seen the Dutch guppy tank, when I did some crazy maintenance on it, I'll put that link up here. But that tank actually had a do-it-yourself CO2 for the longest time, probably I want to say maybe 30% of its lifespan. So I'm going to go over the pros first. So the pros of doing a do-it-yourself CO2 system is one, the affordability of it up front. Two, up front it's cheaper and you get to learn a little bit more about actually using CO2 before you actually invest, if you want to, into those pressurized systems. Three, I really can't find any other reason that you would use a do-it-yourself system. Now that kind of falls into the category of the cons that I have, meaning, or if you get the one that I specifically got or something similar to it, it doesn't come with a solenoid. So that means that that needle valve is going to have to be closed every night and opened up every morning at specific times. You need consistency in an aquarium to maintain that equilibrium and to achieve that equilibrium in the long run and initially. So at the same time, every morning, 2 hours or an hour, whatever you decide your system is gonna be, you need to put your CO2 on, and you're gonna have to get it to the exact same bubble count every single morning. Now, you can get the system that I got, the system that connects to 2 bottles, and I got a bubble counter with a solenoid in there. Second or third con, I don't remember at this point, but the next con is that the bottles that you're using, the soda bottles that you're using, you will be generating a lot of pressure in there, and those bottles are meant to handle a lot more pressure than is actually put in them. Occasionally, you will have bottles that will crack, and you won't know they cracked, but they will leak, and you'll notice the leak because the system won't be able to hold the same amount of pressure in that green area as it normally would, which also ultimately means that you won't be able to have your CO2 at a consistent rate every single time that solenoid turns on every morning. The fourth con, let's go with that was the third. The fourth con is that you have to adjust the little thing that sits into the citric acid right below the water level with a magnet. So if you don't have a magnet, you're gonna have to get one as well. Once again, a couple of cents maybe, I don't know, it depends on where you are. If you magically have a magnet, great, use that. Has to stay just barely underneath the surface of the citric acid and water mixture. Now I say that because if you put it too low and it starts pulling in more citric acid and water, what's gonna happen is you're actually gonna use it up a lot quicker and you're gonna build up a lot more pressure in the system. I've noticed that it's a little trick. If you keep it right below the surface when it needs the citric acid to create that equilibrium, because the CO2 is leaving out through the top into the diffuser, into the fish tank, it won't pull in too much and it won't create too much pressure. The fifth con, see, I have a lot more cons of it, especially because it's a CO2 system it's a do-it-yourself CO2 system compared to a pressurized CO2 system. When you have to maintain this and you have to mix this up, you can potentially crack the bottles. Now, what I mean by that is when you're twisting off those bottles from the little connectors, there's so much pressure built up in there that they feel like they've gotten glued on there, and you're gonna have to use a little bit of force to get it off. And what happens is when you release that pressure to get that force off, the threads stay locked into place, but the bottle starts twisting and ultimately can crack the bottle and you have a leak. Which leads me into my sixth con, is that you don't know if you have a leak for a CO2 system. For a pressurized system, you will know if you have a leak because you can use soapy water, or you'll hear it, and spray it onto the regulator and you'll see if there are bubbles anywhere. For a do-it-yourself system, you may have so many leaks, you're not creating enough pressure that you won't be able to see any soapy bubbles, and you won't be able to hear anything because there's not enough pressure for it to be coming out at a rate to where it makes any noise or it whistles. Now, the pressurized system, it is a lot more money up front, but I definitely still would not recommend it for somebody that's never tried CO2. Make your CO2 first, do it yourself, however you want. The yeast and sugar, the citric acid and baking soda. I personally like the citric acid and baking soda. I've never used the 1 container method. I've always used the 2 container method. It lasts me anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 weeks, which I think is great, because I'm gonna link everything that you can use and that you need for do-it-yourself system in the description below. But that stuff, the citric acid is about $12. The baking soda is literally about $5, and it's for like a 5-pound bag, or if not more. And it'll last you months. It's lasted me months at this point, because every time I have to refill, it's been 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And just imagine you do that once every 3 weeks, you're looking at maybe 4 or 5 months worth of, CO2. It's just, you're gonna have to refill it. You're gonna have to be mindful of it and check up on it. The pressurized system, I literally set it and forget it at that point, but I use the pressurized system for my my really high-tech tanks or my high-tech tank, or like a grow-out tank that I have it on right now, because we moved and I took the CO2 off of everything but the shrimp tank, and I didn't have CO2 on the pea puffer tank. Dude, you're ranting, chill. I'm sorry, I know, there's a lot to say, and I'm trying to make this as quick as possible, but I also want you to be as informed as possible before you make any decisions on CO2 itself. But for now, that's gonna be the end of this video, guys. I really appreciate you sticking around. I appreciate all of the support. I think I have like 18 subscribers now, which is obviously not that much, but come on, that's crazy. I really appreciate all of you guys watching these videos. I just wanted to make these because, it's fun, and I have all these tanks, or not all these tanks, but I have these tanks, and I want to share that, just that journey of the idea to conceptualization to actual physical concept, and show you that, I'm not a professional by any means whatsoever, and I'm gonna have problems. I'm gonna have problems with algae, I'm gonna have problems with lighting, and I'm gonna need to adjust it, and I want to be able to document that and show you guys that it's not a perfect system. It's never a perfect system, not for a very long time. So especially for those newcomers, or those people that want to start out a planted tank, and you want to jump into the deep end with CO2 and a high light, or you want to do the low-tech way with just a regular boring desk lamp and some Java fruit or something like that. I want to show you what's totally possible. I'm not working with perfect systems to where I'm using reverse osmosis water and I'm hardening the water to 120 TDS. That is not a dig to Green Aqua, because that just means that they're using a perfect system, but that's also why they have such beautiful tanks. I have so many ideas in my head and I just want to get them out. Thank you so much for watching, but for now, I will see you in the next one, which should be next Friday. All right, peace out.